She stood in the back of the auditorium, watching him cross the stage in his white coat ceremony. And for just a moment, one fleeting, horrible moment, she saw it. The way his eyes scanned the crowd and passed right over her. The way his smile grew wider when it landed on someone else. And in that instant, standing among hundreds of proud families, Claire Thompson realized that the man she'd spent 5 years building up was about to tear her entire world down. This is a story about sacrifice, about love that gives everything and asks for nothing in return, until there's nothing left to give. It's about the quiet cruelty of being forgotten by someone you refuse to forget, and the strength it takes to walk away from a future you built with your own hands. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you're about to hear isn't just Claire's story. It could be anyone's. It could be yours. The only question is, what would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for looked you in the eye and said those sacrifices meant nothing? Stay with me. This one's going to stay with you long after it's over. What does it mean to truly support someone? Not just emotionally, not just with words of encouragement whispered late at night when doubt creeps in, but with everything you have, your time, your money, your dreams. And what happens when that support becomes so complete, so all-consuming, that you disappear into it? When does love become erasure? These are questions Claire never thought she'd have to ask. For 5 years, she believed in a simple truth, that sacrifice made in love would be honored. That partnership meant building something together, brick by brick, even if one person had to carry more weight for a while. She believed that when he finally made it, when he finally became the doctor he'd always dreamed of being, they'd both stand in that success together. She never imagined that success would be the very thing that pushed her out. So how does a relationship that starts with so much hope end in such cold dismissal? And more importantly, when did the ending actually begin? 7 years ago, Claire met Daniel Hayes at a friend's birthday party in downtown Portland. She was 24, working as a project coordinator at a small marketing firm, finally feeling like she'd found her footing after college. He was 26, charming in that understated way that feels more genuine than charisma, working as a medical scribe while preparing for his MCAT retake. They talked for 3 hours that night, tucked into a corner while the party swirled around them, about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up in a small town in Idaho, the son of a mechanic and an elementary school teacher, about being the first person in his family to even think about graduate school. She told him about her own dreams, maybe starting her own consulting business someday, traveling to Southeast Asia, learning to paint. Simple dreams, achievable dreams, the kind you share with someone when you're still discovering who you might become. 6 months later, they moved in together. A small one-bedroom apartment in Southeast Portland, hardwood floors that creaked, windows that didn't quite seal against the winter rain, but it was theirs. Claire remembered the way Daniel used to study at their kitchen table, medical textbooks stacked like a fortress around him, and how he'd look up sometimes with this expression of pure gratitude, like he couldn't believe his luck, like he couldn't believe someone believed in him the way she did. When Daniel got his acceptance letter to Oregon Health and Science University, they celebrated with cheap champagne and Thai takeout. That night, sitting on their worn couch with the letter between them, they had the conversation that would define the next 5 years of their lives. Medical school wasn't just expensive, it was astronomically expensive. Even with loans, even with the small scholarship he'd been offered, the numbers were staggering. Daniel's parents couldn't help, not in any meaningful way. They were proud, devastated they couldn't contribute more, but the reality was simple. If Daniel was going to do this, they'd have to figure it out together. Claire didn't hesitate. She told them they'd make it work. That's what partners do, right? They'd cut expenses, she'd pick up freelance work on the side. Maybe he could find a part-time research position. It would be tight, but it would be temporary. For years of medical school, then residency. Yes, residency would be hard too, but he'd be earning something by then. They could see the finish line. They could see the life waiting on the other side. A real home. Financial stability. Maybe kids. The future felt close enough to touch. So she said yes to all of it without really understanding what all of it would mean. How could she? How could anyone know what it feels like to slowly dissolve into someone else's dream until you can't remember what your own dreams even looked like? The first year wasn't so bad. Daniel's schedule was brutal. Lectures, labs, study groups that ran until midnight. But the apartment still felt like theirs. He still made time for Friday movie nights, still asked about her day, still pulled her close in the early morning and whispered thank you into her hair. Claire picked up 2 freelance clients on top of her full-time job. The money helped. It helped a lot. She stopped going out with friends as much, stopped buying the little things that make life feel less like survival, but it was okay. It was worth it. She'd catch herself watching him sometimes, bent over his anatomy notes with that look of fierce concentration, and feel this swell of pride. This was her person. They were building something real. But small things started shifting in year 2. Daniel's stress levels escalated. The material got harder, the competition more intense. He started staying at the library until it closed, sometimes not coming home until 1 or 2 in the morning. When he was home, he was distracted, irritable in ways he'd never been before. Claire understood, or she tried to. She took on a 3rd freelance client. She started covering all the groceries, all the utilities, the rent. Daniel's loans covered tuition and books, but everything else fell to her. She didn't complain. She didn't even think of it as something to complain about. This was temporary. This was the plan. Except somewhere in year 2, she realized they hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. Somewhere in year 2, she realized she was lonely. By year 3, Claire's own dreams had become background noise. The consulting business she'd wanted to start? No time. The trip to Vietnam she'd been saving for? The savings were gone, funneled into their shared life, into keeping everything afloat while Daniel focused on boards and clinical rotations. Her friends started inviting her to things less frequently, not out of malice, but because she always said no. She was always working, always tired, always needing to get home in case Daniel needed something. She didn't recognize herself anymore when she looked in the mirror. She'd lost weight, not in a healthy way, but in the way that happens when you forget to eat lunch because you're racing between meetings and freelance deadlines. She stopped wearing the clothes she used to love because what was the point? She was just going to work and coming home to an empty apartment most nights. Daniel barely seemed to notice. His world had narrowed to a laser focus. Excel in rotations, impress attendings, secure a competitive residency. Claire had become part of the infrastructure of his life, as essential and invisible as electricity. She kept the lights on. She kept everything running. And he stopped seeing her. Really seeing her. Year 4 was worse. Daniel started talking about residency matches, about programs in Boston and New York, places where the cost of living made Portland look cheap. He talked about these possibilities with excitement, with ambition, and Claire would nod along, stomach twisting, wondering where she fit into these visions of his future. When she'd try to bring up her own career, her own needs, he'd get this look, patient but distant, like he was humoring a child. "We'll figure it out once I match," he'd say. "Once things settle down. Just a little bit longer." The white coat ceremony was in May, on a bright Saturday morning that felt like a gift after months of gray Portland spring. Claire took the day off work, the first full day she'd taken off in over a year, and bought a new dress for the occasion. Navy blue, simple, professional. She wanted to look like someone who belonged next to him, someone worthy of standing beside a doctor. Daniel's parents flew in from Idaho. His mother hugged Claire for a long time in the hotel lobby the night before, tears in her eyes, thanking her for everything she'd done for their son. His father shook her hand formally, clearly uncomfortable with emotion, but his gratitude was real. They knew. They knew what she'd sacrificed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Hundreds of soon-to-be doctors in their white coats. The auditorium filled with proud families, speeches about service and commitment, and the privilege of caring for others. Claire sat between Daniel's parents, watching him on that stage, and felt this complicated knot of emotions she couldn't quite untangle. Pride, yes. Relief that they'd made it through. But also something else, something that felt uncomfortably like grief. When had they last laughed together? When had he last looked at her with real attention, real curiosity about who she was beyond the person who kept his life functioning? After the ceremony, there was a reception. Daniel was swarmed immediately by classmates, professors, attendings from the hospital where he'd done his best rotation. Claire stood to the side with his parents, smiling, playing the supportive girlfriend role she'd perfected over 5 years. And that's when she saw it. Daniel was talking to another woman, a fellow student Claire had never met. The woman was laughing at something he said, touching his arm lightly. and Daniel was leaning in, animated in a way Claire hadn't seen him in months. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Claire was reading into it, projecting her own insecurities onto an innocent interaction. But something about the way Daniel looked at this woman, really looked at her, with focus and presence, made Claire's chest tighten. That night, back at their apartment, after his parents had left for their hotel, Claire tried to bring it up gently. She asked about the woman, tried to keep her tone light, casual. Daniel barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through residency program emails. "That's just Sarah," he said. "We were in the same small group, first year." Claire waited for more. Nothing came. She pressed a little. "You two seemed close." Daniel finally looked at her, and there was something in his expression she couldn't read. Impatience? Guilt? "We're friends, Claire. That's all. Why are you making this weird?" And just like that, Claire was the problem. She was the one being insecure, paranoid, dramatic. She apologized, hating herself for it, and went to bed feeling smaller than she had in years. The next week, Daniel matched into a highly competitive internal medicine residency at a hospital across town. It was a huge accomplishment, exactly what he'd been working toward. Claire took him out to dinner to celebrate, splurging on a restaurant they couldn't really afford, trying to recapture some sense of partnership, of shared joy. But Daniel spent half the dinner on his phone, texting with other residents who'd matched, making plans for celebration drinks Claire wasn't invited to. When she finally asked if something was wrong, if they were okay, Daniel put his phone down and looked at her with an expression that would haunt her for years. "We need to talk," he said. "If this story feels too real, comment I'm still watching. You're not alone. There's a particular kind of pain that comes not from dramatic explosions, but from quiet dismantling." Daniel didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He didn't even seem particularly emotional. He just explained, calmly, rationally, like he was presenting a diagnosis, that he thought they should separate, that the last 5 years had been important, that he appreciated everything she'd done, but that he'd realized they'd grown apart, that he needed space to focus on this new chapter of his life, that it wouldn't be fair to either of them to keep pretending. Claire sat across from him in that restaurant, the celebration dinner turning to ash in her mouth, and couldn't find words. Grown apart, as if they'd drifted naturally, two boats loosening from the same dock. Not that she'd anchored herself to the shore while he sailed away on winds she'd helped create. She finally managed to ask the only question that mattered. "Is there someone else?" Daniel hesitated just long enough for her to know the truth before he said no. "Not really. It's not about that." But it was. Claire knew it was. Maybe it was Sarah from the white coat ceremony. Maybe it was someone else entirely. But Daniel had already left their relationship emotionally, probably months ago. He'd just waited until he didn't need her anymore to make it official. They didn't even make it home before Claire started crying, ugly, desperate sobs that shook her whole body in the passenger seat of her own car. Daniel drove in silence, occasionally glancing over with something that might have been concern or might have been discomfort. When they got back to the apartment, he told her he'd stay with a friend for a few days to give her space. How generous. How thoughtful, giving her space in the home she'd paid for while he'd pursued his dreams. The next few weeks passed in a haze. Claire moved through her days on autopilot, going to work, coming home to an apartment that felt haunted by the ghost of a future that would never happen. Daniel came by to pick up his things on a Tuesday afternoon when he knew she'd be at work. Professional, clean, avoiding mess. He left a note thanking her again for everything, saying he hoped they could stay friends, that he wanted her to be happy. The note sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Claire finally threw it away. Friends. As if friendship was something you could offer someone after erasing 5 years of their life. As if gratitude was an acceptable substitute for love, for loyalty, for basic human decency. The legal reality of their separation was mercifully simple since they'd never married. No shared assets to divide beyond some furniture Claire told him to just take. She didn't want any of it. Every piece was contaminated with memory. She'd look at their couch and remember studying next to him, bringing him coffee during all-night cram sessions. She'd look at their bed and remember mornings when he used to wake her with kisses, back when he still saw her as someone to move toward instead of someone to move past. Her friends rallied when they found out, showing up with wine and takeout, offering to slash his tires, to leave bad reviews for whatever clinic he ended up working at. Their anger on her behalf helped, but it also highlighted how isolated she'd become. These women who'd once been central to her life were almost strangers now. She'd sacrificed those relationships too, let them atrophy while she poured all her energy into Daniel. Recovery wasn't linear. Some days Claire felt strong, clear-headed, grateful to be free of a relationship that had become so one-sided. Other days she'd find herself crying in the grocery store, staring at the brand of yogurt Daniel liked, wondering if she'd wasted the best years of her life on someone who'd never really seen her value. But slowly, something began to shift. Claire started going to therapy, started untangling the patterns that had led her to give so much of herself away. She reconnected with old friends, started saying yes to invitations again. She took a weekend trip to the coast by herself, something she hadn't done in years, and sat on the beach watching the waves and feeling like she could finally breathe. 6 months after the breakup, Claire got a promotion at work. Not because she was suddenly working harder. If anything, she was working less, no longer carrying the weight of two people's lives, but because she was present again, engaged, bringing creativity and energy she'd forgotten she possessed. She started painting again, something she hadn't done since college. She wasn't good at it, not really, but that wasn't the point. The point was reclaiming parts of herself she'd set aside. A year later, Claire ran into Daniel at a coffee shop downtown. He was with someone, a pretty brunette who looked young and ambitious and full of energy. Daniel introduced her as his girlfriend, a fellow resident. He asked Claire how she was doing with that careful politeness people use when they're trying to prove they're not the villain of someone else's story. Claire could have said so many things. She could have told him about the nights she'd sobbed so hard she made herself sick. She could have told him exactly how much money she'd calculated she'd spent supporting him. Over $60,000, not counting the opportunity costs of the freelance clients she'd burned out on, the career advancement she'd delayed. She could have asked him if he ever felt guilty, if he ever looked back on those 5 years and felt even a flicker of shame. Instead, she smiled and said she was doing really well, which was true, and wished him luck, which was gracious, and walked away with her head high, which was powerful. So here's what I want to ask you. What would you have done? Would you have supported Daniel through medical school knowing how it would end? Would you have walked away sooner, recognized the warning signs, protected yourself? Or would you have done exactly what Claire did? Loved completely, sacrificed fully, believed in a future that was never going to include you? There's no right answer. Love makes us do things that don't make sense from the outside. It makes us give more than we should, stay longer than is healthy, believe in people who've stopped believing in us. But Claire's story isn't really about Daniel at all. It's about the strength it takes to rebuild after giving everything away. It's about learning that you can survive the loss of a future you thought was certain. It's about discovering that the person you become after devastation might be stronger than the person you were before. And if you think this story was hard to hear, wait until you see what we have coming next. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Because these stories, these real human experiences of love and loss and survival, they matter. Your story matters. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if this resonated with you, let us know. We're all just trying to figure this out together.